It's our pleasure today to have Cedric Langbort. Actually, I don't know, French should be Langbort. Yeah. Langbort. So visiting us today, he's a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's also affiliated there with the Coordinated Science Lab, which does some similar things that we do here at GERAD and CIET and Decision Science. And with the Department of Electrical Engineering as well. So he works on applications of control, game theory, optimization to various fields. He has received a number of awards that I'm not going to list here, but in particular, in the last few years, he has been working on information exchange and network dynamics. In particular, he's working now on projects with psychologists, communication scientists, and so on to investigate the dynamics of information over networks. And that's going to be also, I guess, the topic of today's talk. So we're very happy.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, so this all should probably start, I guess, right? Even pre-starting. So I originally interfaced with Professor Mahatma, right? And I thought that was a McGill talk. And so I was like, okay, so back in English. And then I got the emails, and then it's going to be GERAD. And then I don't know. Right? So I still did everything in English. So I apologize.
I think it's good because
right? The slides are in English, but feel free, je suis français comme Jérôme, but si vous voulez poser des questions en français, no problem for that. But yeah. Right. I'm at also a point in my life where it actually expends more mental work to do slide in French. Maybe your experience as well. I don't know. So all of this being said, this is all work that is in the context of this large project that is funded by the U.S. Army Research Office. This is what that logo is supposed to be here. There's no AR on it, but that's the logo associated with the project. And different facets of what I'll be talking about today is joint work with several of my students, Vijay Hebar, Sol Sasaki, and Uli Masuko, as well as in collaboration with, this project is in collaboration with social scientists and economists as well at Stanford. But for this credit, I thought I would focus more on what's more specifically control-y and decision theoretic. So the title is a bit of a mouthful. It's the Strategic Information Transmission View of the quote Misinformation Epidemics. And well, let me get into that. So I feel like this slide is. Is there somebody by the door? Just wondering if you can come in. Are you looking for Okay. So I think this slide is becoming increasingly unnecessary. I think we're all very aware that we're living in a world where misinformation or online misinformation plays an extremely important role. I find it interesting that it was already a word of the year by some dictionary publisher, fake news, right, in 2017, and it's only increased since, right, the world of fake news and misinformation that we live in. And there is, I sometimes include in my talk, but in this one, I found that if you haven't seen Maria Ressa Nobel Peace Prize address from 2021 when she talked, right? She's a journalist who got the Nobel Peace Prize for fighting misinformation, particularly in the Philippines. And she starts with like a reporting of the Hiroshima explosion and says, basically, make no mistake, what's happening in our information ecosystem right now is of the same scale as what happened with Hiroshima. She basically said this, a nuclear bomb exploded in information ecosystem. So the stakes are just couldn't be higher to try to understand misinformation propagation. And they're really and it's only increased since the very first time fake news entered our common vocabulary. Now, again, this has changed in the past years a bit as well, by and large, if you look at even the general public literature, this notion of virality still seems to be one of the first one that's thrown around to explain the propagation of misinformation online, right? That when we say, well, there was this pretty well-cited study that appeared in Nature that said, you know, misinformation spreads faster, deeper, and longer than true news, right? And this is because, quote unquote, it's more viral. Well, this notion of virality, right, is, I guess, a good metaphor to explain how things, to explain the outcome of the spreading process, but it's at pains to explain a lot of aspects that are very specific to the propagation of information, right? When we say, well, this particular meme or this particular piece of news or fake news is viral, and that's why it's spreading, right? When I say viral, right, what that should conjure in your mind is something very similar to a virus, obviously, right? That is, if you come in contact with someone, right, you get infected, right? This virus, this bug jumps on you, and then you're infected as well. And if I come too close in contact with you, I may get it as well. Well, this is not exactly how misinformation spreads. This really is, and well, I'm kind of going forward a little bit, but this paradigm really is missing a lot of pieces in terms of agency and intent. And that's what actually, that's my next slide. I just want to say, this virality paradigm really doesn't allow you to explain a lot of things. It doesn't, right? It can comment on the fact that legitimate and fake news spread differently, but it can't really explain why, right? Other than that to say, well, one is more viral than the other, right? It has a higher and not, okay, fine, maybe. But even if that's true, how do you endogenously predict the fact that a particular piece of news would be more viral than another, right? It seems that you need to feed that into your model. If that's all you talk about in this virality. And it doesn't really allow you to consider any type of quality of information. It's really focusing on the spread. So the starting point for this larger project that we're on is this idea that virality is not enough, right? You really don't want to think of this as even the main part of the spread of misinformation, of the processes that are involved in spreading misinformation. And that first and foremost, you should think of it as a process that involves intentional agents, right? The actors engaged in the production and consumption and diffusion of information, fake or not, right, fake or legitimate, have intent, right? They are not just posting machines. They're not just things that come in contact, right? It's not because I show you a post that tells a lie that you're going to believe it or that you're going to keep propagating it, unlike a virus, right? And that this element of intent is extremely important. And that, you know, this element of banner rationality, of psychology, plays a big role as well, right? And so we're trying to really make this the starting point for our discussion of misinformation production, consumption, propagation, rather than just say, well, you know, here is an infectious model again, and just see how it spreads as in epidemics, right? And so there are different modes of, so the first, right, that's the first thing. The first thing is intent should really feature prominently in how you think about information production, consumption, and propagation. Now, that doesn't necessarily, even when you're considering intent, there's different modes of production, consumption, and propagation of information, right? One of them being persuasion. I'm saying different modes because not every information that goes online is necessarily put online to try to persuade you or to change your mind, right? Some could just be free expression, right? You drew this beautiful picture, you want the world to know about it, and you're not trying to influence anybody's opinion on anything, you're just expressing yourself, right? That wouldn't be persuading. But one type, right? But there's intent, of course, right? You put it online, right? Self-expression is still your intention, right? But So those different type of intentional, modes of information production or consumption, one that is of particular interest, and very relevant again to the world we're in right now, is persuasion. And by persuasion, again, there's different kind of definition, but what I mean is broadly defined, this situation where a sender is putting information online or is sending information with the explicit goal of modifying a receiver's belief or action to their own benefit, right? I am saying you something because I want to change your mind, right? And by changing your mind, get you to implement an action that is beneficial to you, right? So you can already see kind of this leader-follower structure, right? Because I think a lot of people here are you already have this kind of stack over structure naturally coming out of the word persuasion, right? I'm influencing you so that you take an action that's good for me. And I do this knowing that, right? And very much, right? I mean, this is, we're talking with Jerome about that just a few minutes ago, that this is a business model, right? There are companies that, they're not necessarily even companies, but there are people who make money out of specifically farming information and just, right, trying to get your attention and change your opinion. That's a good model. Persuasion is a good model for profit-driven content farm. It's a very good one for propaganda, state-backed propaganda, but also for things that are better, right? In the context of COVID, in the context of helping people make good, healthier decisions for themselves. The public service announcement is also persuading, right? In this case, I'm trying to persuade you for good, to do something that's good for you. My objective is aligned with what's good for you as well, as opposed to propaganda, which may not be, right? And I guess, you know, arguably, that's potentially partly why people use X or Twitter as well. Like, there were surveys that said, it's not, again, 100% of the activity, but persuasion could be the reason why you go online and try to tweet something, is that they're trying to change people's minds. So some surveys, this one is getting a little older now, it's not that recent anymore, it's I think the mid-2010s, but I think more recently, that would be interesting. I would want the New York Times to rerun that survey. You could reason that went up or down, I don't know. So this is about persuasion, right? So it's an intentional mode of information production, right? And this is something that has been studied in economics. Or at least there's a family of models that look at this mode of communication. And it's very much under the umbrella of what's called strategic information transmission. Right? The idea where you have intentional agents sharing information with each other. And typically, the two big subcategories are cheap talk models and Bayesian persuasion. And the difference essentially is cheap talk tends to focus on Nash equilibria, while Bayesian persuasion tends to focus on Stackelberg equilibria, or if you talk to economists who tend to not talk about Stackelberg at all, they just say, you know, equilibrium is permitted. And what this talk is going to be about mostly is extending this idea of Bayesian persuasion past the purely Bayesian framework to better apply to this misinformation context. This being said, again, I was trying to put too much in that talk originally, and so I scaled back a bit. There are some things you can do even with this model, right? Even if you take, I know I haven't told you, I'm going to show you Bayesian persuasion model in a minute. Right, so I haven't specifically told you about the model, but even if you take the model wholesale from economics, where you just say, you have this model of Bayesian persuasion, let me take it wholesale. There's a number of things you can do, which what I call vanilla SIT, right, in some ways, to enrich the type of prediction that we can have. So it's kind of, you know, it's my bit of PR here. So I won't say a whole lot about the bottom one here, right? But we can take those models, put them on a network, right? And basically say that you can consider a situation where you have you're on a platform, you have some sources that are trying to send information to persuade their users, right? So sending information to try to change their mind. right? The users can consume that information, but also get some benefit from being on the platform from the social network, from the social group. And what we're wondering is in the middle, between those sources that are lying to you for their own benefit and the consumers, there is the platform and the platform users, right? There's this, the platform can decide to regulate how okay it is with you lying, right? And you can imagine implementing that by monitoring how much, by fact-checking you regularly. And if you've just been lying too much, just banishing you from the platform, right? You may think of recent events where that type of question offered, right? Should we ban some very prominent people who just keep using our platform to lie, right? Or should we not, right? And what the point of those papers was so there was a first version that was at the Nexus workshop 2 years ago, and then we got a much richer model just accepted. It should hopefully 2024. So at the end of this year in TCNS. So the question we investigated using those models, that type of model over a network with communities, is what we ask is, well, typically when you hear platforms talk about this, right, about whether it's fathomable to banish people that lie too much, you never hear anything about any economical justification or the incentive justification, right? The justification seems to hark back to, well, freedom of speech, right? This is not, right? I have a platform, Musk would say that, right? I'm not going to censor anybody, right? This is not a model of our platform, right? And the argument is not, well, if I do this, I'm not going to censor anybody because otherwise I may lose money or may lose users, because, well, I just think that freedom of speech should be absolute, right? Well, what we did with So is we take a stance off and we say, well, fine, but if really what you cared about was economical incentives, could you do this, right? Because there is arguably an economical, you could position yourself at the platform that doesn't let, right? You could be Reddit, where anything goes, or you could be anti-Reddit. Right? You could be the platform of record where nobody can lie, right? Because if you're caught lying, you're banished forever, right? Would there be an economical advantage to being the latter? And what the work we still did is to prove that actually, yes, you could do that, right? There are stable equilibria where you could act like that, and you could be a surviving platform having a strong sense on how you regulate, right? So that's all I say about this part. Now, another thing you could do taking your...
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Did you factor in the cost of verifying the lie? And because presumably it's huge, no?
That's a good, so not in this model, but you're right. That this is the cost here comes from the threat of using your user.
Sure.
Right?
You need a huge team to investigate, what is a lie, what is that's the problem.
You're right. There is a cost of actually tracking what is a lie, right? So that's partly where that's where the vanilla SIT is, right? It's also, if you take this model of persuasion wholesale, this kind of get endogenized, that you don't have to worry about it. So, but that's exactly one of the pushes where you would want to walk away from that model as is, right? Now, another thing that we did that you can do with those wholesale SIT models is, and enrich them somewhat, that's something that we did with Widget, and I just like showing this slide just because I like telling this story. So it's putting identity in the model of information. So in the model of Bayesian persuasion, the point being that in this case, we react differently to different sources, right? The message is important. What you hear in terms of the message is important, but also who is telling. The same message could be coming from different sources, and you would react differently to them because you feel that you're aligned with the source or you're not, right? For example, you could be from one party, hear some information from another party and say, well, yeah, of course they would say that. I'm not going to believe it, right? And so identity is bundled into the message as well, right? And there is, again, I encourage you to read the paper, but I just want to tell this story because I think it's funny, or in a way. So what is identity that we put in this model? We took it from the original definition from Cashfeld, who introduced this element of identity. And so what is identity? It's an affiliation with a group. And when you consider that you're affiliated with one group, you de facto define an in-group and an out-group, and you react differently to in-group with respect to the out-group. And the central thing is that once you've made this definition, the way in which you situate yourself within those groups is all comparison-based. There is no absolute measure. What matters, right, is you do relative comparison for how your group or how yourself as part of the in-group benefits compared to the out-group. So it's all relative comparison. That's what social identity, that's how social identity ends up affecting some user's utility function, is in relative. And the story that goes with that is, that's a story that's called Vladimir's choice. Just to show that, I mean, that goes back even to Cashfeld himself, but to show that there is some truth in that, at least at the feelings level. So Vladimir's choice is a story that's kind of popular, I think, in a number of Eastern European folklore. So what's the story? There was this farmer called Vladimir, right? And one day, some angel, some archangel appears to him and say, you're in luck. I know you're a good person. I can grant you anything you want, but whatever you get, your neighbor gets twice, right? So if I give you 1,000,000 rubles, he gets 2,000,000 rubles, right? And so, or whatever you want. You get 1 cow, he gets 2 cows. And so after thinking long and hard, Vladimir said, I know what I want. Take one of my eyes out. Right? And that's this relative comparison. Right? And yeah, sure, you may be bad, right? But you're hurting even more, right? Or the even more jocular but relative type of, right? So that goes to this relative comparison. The other things that feed into the same story is, when are you really rich? What does it mean for anyone to be rich? Well, I mean, that's also a relative concept. And some people say you're rich if you're richer than your brother-in-law. We may think about that one too, but it's the same idea, right? And so when you take this relative element coming with identity, you get, again, and you add that into your off-the-shelf strategic Bayesian persuasion model, you also can get some kind of interesting predictions that show, so again, I don't want to go into the details, but the main take-home message from this work with the is the fact that if you have an identity-minded audience, and even if part of it has this, you could have a purely self-interested part of the audience, but the other one making those relative comparisons, having identity, right, in some of your audience, this is enough in a completely Bayesian persuasion rational viewpoint. This is enough to drive a well-meaning sender, that is a sender who only wants to provide correct information to his entire readership, to start becoming polarized and saying only very good things about one type and only very bad things about another. Okay. So again, I couldn't do justice to everything, but the point is, going back to the full general narrative that we have here, is you can do some interesting things, and taking wholesale this model of Bayesian persuasion of strategic information transmission from economics and getting to interesting prediction. Now, something's still amiss with this Bayesian persuasion story. And that's what I want to spend the rest of this talk getting into more detail of it. So that's more of the work that we did with Olivier. So what is still amiss? Well, it's in the name. It's Bayesian persuasion. Right? So Bayesian persuasion is good because, again, it's not It has nothing to do with, it doesn't pretend to give you a virality-based explanation of how, how people get influenced. It has intent, but it looks at intent, right? Very clearly assuming Bayesianity and rationality on the part of the consuming agent, right? There's a source, it's in the name. And again, the next slide is going to show you what I mean. I know that we all want to see the math because what do you mean by Bayesian? But this is all this to set it up, right? But this is not how we're not Bayesian. We're not Bayesian agents, right? We're not rational agents, right? And so if at the crux of your model to describe persuasion, you have to make those assumptions. You're definitely missing something about being able to model misinformation propagation, right? Or misinformation production and misinformation consumption. And so what we're trying to do with Olivier is to enrich this model of Bayesian persuasion to be able to consider departures from Bayesianity, right? That still sit. So this is what the work and what the remainder of the talk is. It's trying to systematically model the effect of this lack of rationality and Bayesianity of the consumer, right? The consumer information. But because we're not the first one to introduce this thing, but we're trying to be we're trying to remain relatively agnostic about the process, the way in which we're not Bayesian. Why? Well, you'll see why. So does that make sense? Right? So now we're ready to do some math. Okay. But so what is what I call the vanilla Bayesian persuasion model? So at its bare bones, right? This is what it looks like. This looks a lot like a Bayesian test channel or something that you would encounter in information theory. You have an information source, right? That generates the state of the world. The sender, whom we call Alice, observe the state of the world exactly, while Bob, the receiver, doesn't, right? And there's a communication channel from Alice to Bob. There may or may not be noise in this communication channel, right? Even in the basic canonical against K model, there is no noise, right? And so each one of them has a utility. Alice has a utility V that depends on the action of Bob, A, and the state of the world. And Bob has its own utility U that also depends on his own action and the state of the world, right? But the communication here costs nothing, right? So how does it work? Alice sees the true state of the world, right? She sends a message M to Bob according to a known mechanism that she commits to, and she announces the mechanism. That's her strategy for policy. Upon receiving the action, right? So Bob has a prior on Omega, then he receives the message. So he turns his prior into a posterior, right? Conditioned on this information on the message that he received. Then maximizes his utility U, his expected utility conditional on the message, right? That's how he chooses his A. And what is Alice trying to do? Knowing that this is what Bob does, Alice has to choose the mechanism by which she sends M, such that the action of Bob is good for her. Maximizes her a priori expected utility. Does that make sense? Right? And so as part of my, right, and the question of Bayesian persuasion is what should Bob play and how should Alice message Bob so that this action, again, his optimal action upon receiving and conditioning on him is optimal for him. Right? So it has this element of persuasion, telling you something so that your action is good for me. Right? Conditional on the information that I release to you. Right? Now, okay, so I guess that's kind of expressing, I think I went through that already. The important thing is, right, this is a stack of work, but Alice is the leader there, right? She commits to her policy, right? But the thing that's important is this use of Bayes' rule, right? That when you compute your, when Bob turns his prior into a posterior, he uses Bayes' rule exactly, right? the condition on that message is by using Bayes' rule, right? That's where the assumption that Bob is Bayesian is important. Okay. But what if, well, let me keep going there and then I'm going to go. But what if Bob is not Bayesian? Right? And when I say that, okay, I mean, I can say it in English, but mathematically, what do I mean? Right? Non-Bayesian, how does it matter? What does it fail to do? Like, is it trying to apply Bayes' rule, but maybe it makes mistakes in computing those ratios? Does it not know its prior very well? Does it not know Alice's, or does it have particular biases in specific ways? There's a lot of ways in which Bob could be non-Bayesian, right? That's kind of like the Anna Karenina viewpoint, right? That's the beginning of Anna Karenina, right? That says, if you're Bayesian, there's only one way to be Bayesian, right? If you apply Bayes' rule. When you're non-Bayesian, you could be anything else is non-Bayesian, right? So there's different, right? Could be incorrect computation, incorrect prior, confirmation bias, where, for example, there is some true, you announce what Alice's policy is, but because you have the selective bias towards what you prefer, you say, no. I don't believe those conditional probabilities, right? She said A, but I prefer B. So every time she says A with some probability, I'm going to assume that she really said B, right? Because I'm not listening, right? And economists have started looking at models that are completely attached to a specific assumption in which Bob deviates from this Bayesian assumption. What we want to do is to try to model this, maybe a way a control theorist would do it, more robustly, right? That doesn't need to go into the specific assumption in which you fail to be Bayesian, but still model the possible ways in which Bob is non-Bayesian, okay? And now I want to say something let me go back here. So we think it's valid. We think this is valid because, again, humans in general are not Bayesian, right? And you could say, well, fine, you're extending Bayesian persuasion, right, to non-Bayesianity. That's great, okay? Well, maybe that's not great, but at least it's interesting, right? But we're doing more than this in the sense that the only solution to traditional Bayesian persuasion, I'm going to explain, this is what this slide does, relies 100% on the fact that Bob is Bayesian. Right? The only way in which we can solve this problem is because Bob is Bayesian. I'm going to explain to you how you do it, right? At least conceptually. Or the only type of structural information you have about Alice's policies is something you can derive because you assume that Bob is Bayesian. If Bob is not Bayesian, the standard technique to solve this problem there's nothing else. Right? And so it's not just that we're extending the class of problems that we think are worth being considered, it's that we need to invent the toolbox that goes with it. Okay? And so why do I say that? Why is it so important? Why is it central or critical to assume that Bob is Bayesian? Well, because the way you solve the Bayesian persuasion problem. So again, remember, this is what we're trying to do. Right? So Alice, again, is, so assume that Bob is, so again, Bob received the message, right? Turned his prior mu into a posterior, which is the conditional, this is mu condition on M, right? And, well, I guess on this slide, he's a minimizer. So minimizes this, takes the A that minimizes this his expected utility. And this is the typical notation. This is an expectation, right? Because the utility is utility of A and omega, where omega is a random variable. And here I replace my omega by a distribution. So this is really the expectation of UA omega with omega distributed by mu m. And mu m is the conditional probability. Is everybody with me? Right? So this is the A that Alice expects from from Bob, right? And then puts it in her own utility and tries to minimize that. I guess on this slide, they're minimizing. Okay, now, okay, it turns out, so it seems that if you think about it this way, what you're trying to solve for, again, is the transmission policy that Alice is using, right? The map from omega to m, or the stochastic map from omega to m, right? But it turns out that if you're trying to solve the problem that way, you get something very nasty with nested knot complexity. You don't want to do it this. What the canonical and Genskow paper or result tells you is what you should solve is not in terms of this transmission mechanism. You should solve in terms of beliefs. What your variable should be the beliefs that are induced at Bob, the mu m's, right? Which beliefs are induced once you condition on m, and tau, which is the distribution of those beliefs. The joint distribution of omega and the beliefs. You should reparameterize the problem, not in terms of the transmission policy of Alice, but in terms of which belief she conjures in Bob and how they are jointly distributed with omega. If you do this, you end up with a problem like this, where her belief, her utility, so this is Alice's program, her utility has this form. It's the expectation of her utility when the beliefs are distributed according to tau. Okay. And what is this condition? That's what's called Bayes plausibility, right? Again, the mu m are the beliefs that are generated at Bob, right? So this says, and this is kind of the central lemma, this says that if you're Bob and you receive this message from Alice, right? The set of posteriors that you could hold has to satisfy this equality, meaning that on average, right, you have to reconstruct a prior. In other words, right, let me say that in other words, this is very central. There is an equivalence. The set, if you start from a prior, right? If I give you a prior, and I'm wondering which kind of posteriors could you have if there is a mechanism, right, that sends a message to you, right? And I'm saying this set is exactly, right, there's an equality between sets of distributions. The set of posteriors you could hold is exactly the set of posteriors who, on average, are the prime. Is that making sense?
So sorry. So I'm trying to parse this expectation of a tau of the posterior because the so tau and mu are mu is the posterior. So tau and mu are linked. I mean, they are not independent variables.
So mu bar is a prior.
Yeah.
Mu m is the posterior condition on the message m. Yeah. And tau is the distribution of them. So each message, right? Each message generates a new posterior, right? But they're sent probabilistically themselves, right?
So why is mu a variable at all? Like, why is mu a decision variable at all? Like, because it says here a pair. Basically, what you choose is tau. What you choose is the distribution over posterior.
But you don't know which posterior you're inducing because you choose the message. So this way of rewriting the problem says what you should consider as variable is the pair. Which belief you induce and with what probability you want to induce.
So Urbana is the prior for Bob to make the decision?
It's the prior is joint. It's the same for both, for Alice and Bob. But yes.
I mean, isn't your like
the mu distribution is the prior, and after the message it becomes the posterior for Alice, and then
the posterior for Bob. Posterior for Bob. Bob received the message.
okay.
Right? And so he does Bayes' rule, like he knew the prior is mu bar. And every time he receives a message, this prior turns into a posterior, right? Just doing Bayes' rule on that message. But that's only if you receive M. Now you could receive a number of different messages. So that's why there's a distribution of posteriors, right? Because every message generates a different posterior, which is a distribution, right? But you're only getting that message stochastic. So there's a distribution, it's a distribution of a distribution, right?
Is that how like you have this Bob bases his decision based off of what Alice decides, and then Alice thinks about what Bob is going to do to decide what, and then Bob can decide what.
Well, it's not ad infinitum. It's only once because it's a stack over.
Okay.
So Alice says, if I send this message, what is Bob going to do? He's going to turn his prior into a posterior and choose the action that maximizes his conditional expectation. I know he does that. Knowing that that's what he does, what should I send him? Right? The ad infinitum would be a Nash equilibrium.
Okay.
This is not. This is stack over. This is Alice leads. Alice knows that Bob is going to react in this way, and she says, given that that's what he's going to do, what should I do?
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Since the pair should be tau and mu bar instead of
Tau and mu. So mu bar is the prior. Mu, right? Mu is here is the posterior. So I can think, again, I can think in terms of the signaling policy that Alice uses. So that would be a map from omega to M. Right? When Alice observes this particular state of the world, omega, which message should she send with some probability? Right? It's not even deterministic. Right? Given that it's raining today, with some probability I take an umbrella, with some probability I take a raincoat, with some probability I take nothing. Right? So I could try to solve in terms of that, in terms of the stochastic map. What canonical against tells you is you could try to do that, but it's not going to be very computationally well behaved. What you should do instead is not think in terms of that, but think in terms, change variables to the posterior that it generates, that are generated for Bob, and the probability with which those posteriors are generated. Tau, mu and tau. And if you do that, what's interesting is that there is this equivalence that a belief, a set of belief that is generated by a signaling mechanism for Bob, or a belief is generated at Bob if and only if, on average, it's an average of a distribution, right? You have distributions and you average them, right? But if and only if the average of the distribution is the prior. So sometimes in economics, people call this splitting game. Those games, because what you're doing is you're splitting the prior into posteriors, but when you reaggregate them together according to how they're distributed, you get the prior back. So it's kind of like splitting the prior distribution. All right. So
that being said, maybe I missed, but what's the definition of Bayes plausible?
that's this. You play.
So it's more like a definition because here it's a lemma.
Well, that's the Bayes plausibility lemma. So the Bayes, so you could define beliefs that are Bayes plausible as this, as those that satisfy the orange formula. And then the lemma is the Bayes plausible if and only if there is a mechanism. There is a signaling mechanism that generates the mu-m after Bob takes his Bayes rule. Yeah.
So like what is something being Bayes plausible depend on, does it just depend on what kind of policy analysis is choosing? Or
The only thing it depends on is on Bob using Bayes' rule.
so it's not a very strong assumption?
It is not.
Okay.
It isn't, well, it is and it isn't. It is in the sense that it allows you to reformulate that problem. But it is not in that it's a two-line result. It's just using Bayes' rule, essentially, right? But for the purposes that I mentioned earlier, so that's a great question, right? It's 100% Bayesianity. If Bob does anything other than the exact Bayes' rule, it's not true, right? That's exactly my point. So I think it's worth spending the time. It was worth spending the time on this slide because that's precisely my point. If you want to say, I want a model of persuasion in which Bob is not exactly precisely Bayesian, all of this goes out of the window. All of it. Okay? Why is this program good? Well, if you look at it, and again, I recommend the Gensko canonical paper is actually pretty good. I mean, it's written by economists, so you know you have a lot of philosophy at the beginning and the proofs in the appendix, but it's rather readable. So if you're solving for tau and mu, right, this is convex. This is a convex constraint on the mu1, right? It's telling you on average it's equal to, you know, mu bar, right? And so you're trying to find which mu m to use. This is a convex combination of the values at mu1, right? And if you imagine that you only have a finite number of them, right? So you decide what the points are, the mu1, right? Imagine you have a finite number of them, and everything is finite dimensional as well, so that the mu m distribution is just points in space, right? So you decide where you put your points. Just draw it. Right? Maybe your mu's are just on the line, right? So you decide, you decide where to put your points. This is fixed, this is your mu bar, right? So when you average them, you decide where you put these and the distance from there, such that when you combine them, right? When you take the convex combination, you need to get mu bar. Right? And you also, if this is your weights, alpha and 1 minus alpha, that's also the weight you put on their values, B. You combine them with the same weights, right? So you can move these 2 points or this endpoint. I mean, this really tells you how to solve it graphically when you're in 1 dimension. If you have more than 1 dimension, this is structurally interesting, but you can't construct a graphical solution like that. But if you have, right, if you're just in 1D, right, you imagine you have to move these points such that they average, you choose where you put those points and what the weights are, such that when you move them, again, the average is fixed, but you're trying to get as high as possible with those values of B bar, of B hat, sorry. So you end up basically taking, in this case, it's a min. So you'll end up taking the convexification of that function.
Can I put all the weight on just one point?
You absolutely can. That would be either full revelation. If you put all the weight on one point, right? So if you put all the weight on one point, but you have to get a new bar, that one point has to be exactly there, right?
So, like in that case, can you just change like the minimization over like over the individual points? But
you could, but that may or may not be optimal. But you could exactly put all the weight on one point, in which case that means that the belief that you generated is the same as the prior. The posterior is the same as the prior, so that means you gave me no information, right? So again, this is in the paper. I spent more time on this slide than I wanted, but I think it's still fine. Right? Hopefully, I'll just tell you how we went out. The point being that again, anything in that entire side of the world about Bayesian persuasion, right? It just seems like it's just the name, But it's much more than just a name. If it's not Bayesian, you can't do anything. Okay? So what did we do with Olivier to try to go around this, especially being agnostic and just saying, well, there's so many ways you can be non-Bayesian, right? So what we said is, again, taking kind of a robust, control-y way of thinking. We're saying, well, maybe we should think of Bob as being non-Bayesian as how? We're saying, Bob, right? This is what's in orange there. That instead of Bob taking exactly the Bayesian update, given the message, maybe he generates an arbitrary belief in a ball around that belief, right? Kind of a worst case. I don't know what he does. I don't want to go into the details of the mechanism of what went in his brain of, did he have confirmation bias? Did he make a mistake? No, I'm just going to say there's a ball around the true Bayesian update, right? And his belief, his posterior belief could be anywhere on that ball. Ball defined in the spaces of the distribution. So when I say ball, take that with a grain of salt. Could be, could be a Wasserstein distance ball, could be a KL distance ball, could be any kind of other divergence type ball, right? But they kind of, in the linear quadratic case that I'm going to show after that, they kind of collapse on top of each other, so it's okay. But so the idea is, what is Alice doing? She still wants to minimize this thing, but now what goes this V hat prime is the worst case over the ball, right? She's assuming, so it's exactly like a robust control or H infinity viewpoint, right? Is I'm min-maxing. I'm trying to minimize my utility, assuming that Bob could do the absolute worst case over that ball of posterior belief. Everybody with me? Right? And so this ball, again, could take a whole lot of different shapes, but in the linear quadratic case, or in the linear Gaussian quadratic case, right? So if you're, which again, as engineers is always the first thing we try, right? So what do I mean by that? The state of the world is Gaussian. Omega is Gaussian, right? It's normally distributed. The utility, and the utilities are quadratic. Actually, there's no linear. The Gaussian quadratic, right? So Alice's utility is quadratic. Bob's utility is quadratic in omega and A, right? And omega is Gaussianly distributed, right? It's normal, right? In that case, for a large variety of distances, as I said, Wasserstein distance, KL divergence, other type of divergences, you can show that the ball in, it's really a ball in, again, probability space, but it ends up being in bijection with the ball of the mean of that distribution. The only thing that matters for the utility and the ball is the mean of that distribution, okay? And so when you do that and you rewrite things properly, this is what Alice's program looks like. I know I'm jumping a lot of things, but I'm trying to end us on the point, but I think it was important or close to time, right? But I think it was important to spend the time that we did on Bayesian. So in the pure, again, Gaussian quadratic persuasion problem, if everything was truly Bayesian, if Bob was truly Bayesian, you would only have what's not in orange, right? So it ends up that you could solve sigma here is the covariance matrix of the posterior, okay? And so you see how this is, if you forget the orange part, right? In this case, you could rewrite your Bayesian persuasion program entirely as a nice semi-definite program, right? You're just trying to minimize the trace of D, which is a null matrix, like sigma over tau bar over sigma, right? The non-Bayesianity of Bob ends up entirely into this orange, right? So the Bayesian case we could solve, right, in terms of the covariance of the posterior, right? And it ends up, the solution is actually pretty natural. It's always a projection. So that means if you're in one dimension, it's all or nothing. Alice should either tell you everything she knows about omega or nothing at all. If you're multiple dimension, there's a number of channels, right? Because omega is a vector, right? And so either there are some components of omega that she should tell you fully, and others where she should say nothing. Right? That's what ends up coming out of solving this program in black. But now my Bob is non-Bayesian. So there's this extra term. And I don't know about you, but this doesn't look very nice. Right? This is an expectation over, again, your distribution of posterior of the max of something. Right? And so there is no hope to be able to solve it exactly like that. But what we did with Olivier is we actually managed to bound this term tightly in something that looks like this. The details are not important. What's important is that, so this is the term, this is where all the non-Bayesianity lives, right? And the thing that's important is that the bracketed term here is the same as the bracketed term at the top, up to a factor gamma that we get fully corrected. Right? So we can bound this term between, right, a term and a factor of the same term. Now, when you put that back into the program, take what the bound is, you end up being able to upper bound and lower bound Alice's cost fully as well. Right? That's what I mean here. That fully, globally, you can't solve Alice's program exactly, the true optimum, but you know you can bound the optimal value of Alice's program within a constant ratio of the solution of this problem. Now, I wanted to say that, I guess, well, I missed my point. That's okay. It's different than that. Well, let me make that clear. Because I'm assuming, again, at least some of you who work with the DGN, you guys know about the Witzenhausen character. Do people in the room know about Witzenhausen? Anyone? Some? Okay. Then maybe no, some. No Witzenhausen. Okay. But there's something interesting about it. A connection on it. But anyway, so I'm not going to say it. So, right, the point is there's Alice's real program that I care about. I can't solve it, and I have no hope of solving it. But I can bound it tightly within the solution of that program, which is, it's better. It's much better, in particular the square root here. So it's still convex, right? It's not exactly, it's not a pure SDP. That would be pure SDP, right? But I have a square root of this term, so it's still, right?
So, I mean, for the solution, let's say, just take the original problem where you just have trace plus C. So the reason it's all or nothing from the optimization is just depending on the, let's say, depending on the,
right.
If say if your scalar D is positive, then you max it.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
So, but here is it the same? Because
so
also E and D.
So the structure, exactly that. That's also interesting is that program that you end up structurally, and this is exactly my next slide, right, is the minimal rank solution of that program. So is also a projection. Okay, so it's also in 1D all or nothing, right? But in multiple dimension, it's also there are some coordinates that you communicate and others that you don't, right? And but it's not clear that they're the same, right? That you would have without any Bayesian, right? It's still projection, they may not be the same projection. But what's interesting is that the rank of the projection, right, that because your policies are projection, the rank is kind of giving you a measure of quantity of information. Not as precisely as Blackwell, if you guys know about Blackwell, in the sense that Blackwell is not just the amount of information. I mean, it's a precise measure of the amount of information that tells you whether it's useful for decision making or not. But I could say that if I'm using a projection, right, the higher dimensional the image of that projection is, the more information is being given, right? If you think of just a whole bunch of parallel channels, right? If I have only one channel that's passing something, well, I get, in a way, it's not one bit of information, but I get one channel of information, and that's ametric, right? I could argue that that's less information than 3 channels of information, right? But what's not clear is it's whether it's truly useful to Bob to get it. But if you do this, so again, we're able to bound Alice's real program by one where we can solve, where the solution are also projection, not necessarily the same projection as the non-Bayesian case, as the Bayesian case, right? And we can show that as you let Bob become increasingly less Bayesian, that means you let this ball become bigger and bigger, right? That's, at least within the confine of this model, that's how we can model Bob, right? So, right, if your ball has a very small radius, you're almost Bayesian, right? You only allow posteriors that are very close to the real Bayesian posterior. But as the ball increases, the rank, we can show that the rank of this optimal solution decreases as well. So the more Bob is non-Bayesian, the more non-Bayesian Bob is, the less information Alice gives to him in terms of that rank measure. And numerically, this is an example that shows that if epsilon is the size of the ball, right, you have this discrete drop in the rank. So originally Bob gets full information from Alice, or Alice wants to give full information to Bob, then she drops one channel, then she drops another one, then eventually she drops everything, right? So there is some discontinuous, but there is a threshold after which Alice is providing no information. However, and this is my last slide, again, this is a metric of information, just one, but it's not as good as Blackwell, because really Blackwell is not just in terms of how much information was given to Bob, but how useful this information is to Bob to take decision as well. The nice thing that Olivier was able to present at the very last CDC is that in the scalar case, you can actually solve this problem that looks terrible for Alice. You can solve it, but not in terms of these variables. You can solve it using what's called Blackwell's P function. And in that case, the structure is interesting, but it's only for 1D. So we're working on seeing whether we can generalize it or not. If it's not all or nothing, right? Even though the approximation has this all or nothing structure, what the true optimal looks like in 1D is that depending on where you are in the ball, or on the side of the ball, there are part of the state space where you say everything, and part where you say nothing. Right? It's not all or nothing for everybody. It's not a quantization either, exactly. Right? It's really part of it, you get the full omega, and others where I say nothing. But this is, again, this would take us too far to be able to do that. But the point, again, that this is the end, is I think there's definitely a lot of interesting, within the confine of this work, there's a lot of interesting question in relaxing this Bayesian assumption, in particular ones that are agnostic to the process that Bob is using. Some of the things that Olivier is looking at is, multi-sender, multi-receiver. Is there something where the fact that if you're in a crowd, if some people in the crowd are non-Bayesian, but some are the Bayesian helped by the fact that they are non-Bayesian, or are they hurt, or does it matter, or does it help, right? That kind of question, but more generally, I think there's a lot of interesting questions in at the intersection of the kind of decision-making and psychology prompted by misinformation. Now, of course, the urgency of it is another thing, and it's not clear whether the impact is immediate or not. But in terms of questions, I think this is very valuable because, again, adding all the psychological factors, all those deviation from those elements of pure rationality, pure Bayesianity, introduce things that are non-trivial mathematically. So that's interesting. And I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.